what needs explaining is not aging, but rejuvenation. That was his view. And the opposite view was Weizmann, who had such an influence on genetics, because they're famous for his soma germplasm distinction. August Weizmann, who was German, said that cells are basically immortal.
So, hello and welcome to the Sheekey Science Show, where in this video I spoke with Rupert Sheldrake, a renowned biologist and author best known for his hypothesis of morphic resonance. Sheldrake has authored several scientific papers and books, with his work extending beyond traditional biology and into more controversial areas like telepathy and unexplained phenomena. We touched upon several of these topics in this video, as well as his interest in aging research. I hope you enjoy. We also share a common academic lineage in that we both have spent time at the Department of Biochemistry here in Cambridge. So I guess I like to think of myself as a biochemist, but I'm kind of curious to know how your time spent there has influenced the way you think about science today.
Well, one reason I did Biochemistry Part 2 was because I've always been interested in the whole of biology, plants and animals. And I didn't want to have to be forced to be a plant scientist or an animal scientist or a microbial scientist. And biochemistry seemed the subject which would leave all options open. And indeed it did. When it came to doing a PhD in the biochemistry department, I did plant biochemistry, partly because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life decapitating rats. And also because I'd done botany before. I've always been very interested in plants. So for me, the biochemistry was wonderfully informative as dealing with the most fundamental principles of biology. And in many ways, it's been rebranded molecular biology. But molecular biology, as I see it, is basically biochemistry, but made to sound a bit more sort of dashing and fashionable. At least it was when it was rebranded in the 1970s and 80s. That, I think, is like the basis for understanding the fundamental metabolic and other synthetic and metabolism of organisms. But what I've always been interested in is form and behavior. And biochemistry doesn't help that much with form and behavior of plants or animals. When I was working in the biochemistry department, I was working on the production of the plant hormone auxin. And that is a kind of crossover between biochemistry, because auxin's a simple molecule, indole acetic acid, and yet it has many morphogenetic effects in plants. So for me, that was a wonderful bridge to getting more into whole plant physiology and whole plant morphogenesis.
Understood. And so I agree with your points entirely. I think that's also similar reasons why I decided to study biochemistry. But as I sort of progress through my academic career, I should say, I'm interested in trying to find like the best approaches to sort of ask experimental questions and how to go about that. Which somewhat leads me on to this book I read of yours recently, which is these 7 experiments that, if conducted, will change the world. And this book originally, I think you published in 1994, which is, I guess, 30 years ago now. And given like how experimental techniques and everything has changed, reflecting back on that book, what experiments should we be doing right now? And which ones do you think are most important?
Well, the 7 experiments, I mean, I won't go through them all now, but one of them was called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. And the reason I put that there is because I worked on a hypothesis of morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields, and more generally morphic fields, form-shaping fields that shape behavior as well as form. And as a result of this hypothesis, I got interested in the idea that members of social groups may be linked at a distance. Then I realized this theory actually predicted telepathy, which, as you know, is a taboo topic within the sciences. I then realized that it predicted that if it occurred, it should be a purely biological phenomenon, not some special phenomenon of people. And then I realized that almost no research had been done on telepathy in animals. Um, I then started asking people with dogs and cats if they'd ever noticed the animals seemed to pick up their intentions. And overwhelmingly, people said, yes, they do. And I suddenly, when I asked for stories, they poured in. And the most testable claim that people made about their animals was that they knew when they were coming home. The dog or cat would go and wait at a door or window, sometimes half an hour before the person got home, even when they came at non-routine times, even when they traveled by public transport, so there was no familiar car sound. So what I proposed, that was one of the experiments I proposed, because I thought if telepathy exists, it's very important because it changes our view of how minds work. And if it exists and exists in animals, then it's a biological phenomenon that shouldn't trigger off all the taboos that people are worried about with humans. Maybe it's supernatural or something like that. I don't think it is. I think it's normal, not paranormal. So then I thought, well, this is fairly easy to do experiments. So I then did a whole lot of experiments, hundreds of them. We set up a video camera in the house of people who had dogs that knew when they were coming home. We had them go at least 5 miles away. We had them come home in unfamiliar vehicles at random times to rule out routine or familiar car sounds. And over again, the dogs went and started waiting when they decided to come home, even before they got in the taxi or the unfamiliar vehicle. And then all the videotapes were evaluated independently, actually by someone who'd done a PhD in the Department of Biochemistry at Cambridge. And she didn't know any of the details of the experiment, just had to write down when the dog was going to the door. So anyway, that experiment, which I've done with quite a number of dogs now, definitely showed that they were doing this. It's all published in peer-reviewed journals. So that's one of the 7 experiments that actually has been done now. It hasn't changed the world yet because most people with dogs say, of course, my dog does that all the time, and with cats. And they're utterly unsurprised by these results. And most people who feel they've got to uphold scientific taboos say, well, it's impossible, therefore all the evidence must be flawed. There's no point reading it. So unfortunately, it hasn't moved things on as much as I hoped. But what it has done is revealed that the main opposition to this is not based on a detailed analysis of the evidence, but on pure denialism. So another of these 7 experiments was on homing pigeons and how they find their home. And when I wrote that book in the 1990s, no one really had a clue, but the 2 main theories were smell and magnetism. And those are still really the 2 main theories. The proponents of smell thought they'd refuted magnetism by putting magnets on pigeons and showing they could home perfectly well if you disrupt any putative magnetic sense. And the opponents of smell cut the olfactory nerve or anesthetized the nasal mucosa with xylocaine and showed they could still home perfectly well. So actually, it's neither smell nor magnetism. And I had a theory there's a kind of link between the pigeons and their home, a direct link through a morphic field, a sense of direction. So to test this hypothesis, as I propose in the book, instead of moving the pigeons from the home, which is the usual experiment, move the home from the pigeons and see if they can find it. And I did this with mobile pigeon lofts. One of them was done on an estate near Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. And the pigeons could find the loft, even we only moved it relatively small distances. There was nothing mysterious about them finding it, but they wouldn't go into it because they were terrified of the unfamiliar surroundings. So I managed to persuade the Royal Dutch Navy to do this experiment on a naval research vessel at sea. And we had pigeons homing to the boat over 3,000 miles to the Caribbean and 3,000 miles back. The pigeons were homing, so in one case, we homed over 300 miles to the ship. So It was only a preliminary project, and I haven't been able to persuade anyone to do it since then. And there are a lot of underused super yachts, but I don't know many billionaires who own one. So it's not the kind of thing you can do in a university department, because it requires, infrastructure that you can't possibly pay for it. It would be so expensive. The only thing is to get people to do it for free, like the Royal Dutch Navy. Another of the 7 experiments was the feeling of being stared at, where 95% of people have experienced being stared at from behind and turned around to find they're being looked at. And I did lots of experiments on that, many in schools and colleges, to see if people can tell in a randomized series of trials they looked at from behind, either looked at or not looked at, can they tell? And above chance they can. Now, no one knows how that works. I don't know how it works myself. And again, it's the same problem as with telepathy, because the so-called skeptics say this is impossible. The mind's nothing but the brain. Mental activity is brain activity. It's all inside the head. Therefore, this phenomenon can't exist. Therefore, all the evidence is flawed. So we're not even going to bother to look at it. So on the other hand, when you talk to most normal people who aren't working in a science lab at a university, they usually say, of course, that happens to me all the time. So it's most of these phenomena I do research on are ones where the majority of people say, of course, what's all the fuss about? And the minute you step into a scientific institution, it's total denial and so on. So that's frustrating. So none of them have actually changed the world yet, but I still think that when taken seriously, these phenomena will force us to expand our worldview, which I think is much too limited at the moment.
So obviously I read your book, and I think, some of the data you present is quite compelling, and therefore I guess my question is, will we ever be able to work out exactly why these things happen, and what sort of experiments do we need to be doing next to sort of take it the next step, and how exactly will that then change the world?
Well, for example, the sense of being stared at, I've taken it to several next steps in actually more recent research. One thing I've established is that it's essentially directional. People don't just feel a vague sense of unease and look around to see if there's someone looking at them. They usually turn and look straight at the person looking at them. The second thing that I and my colleagues have established is it happens equally well with animals, if not better. And with mammals and birds, we haven't yet done any experiments with reptiles or fish. There's some evidence it works with octopuses, which are mollusks, but I think it's very widespread in the animal kingdom. And I think it may have evolutionary roots, because a prey animal that could tell when a predator was looking at it from behind would escape better than one that couldn't. So it's directional. It's very widespread in the animal kingdom. Then I'm trying to work on how it could possibly work. One thing it implies, which again is taboo, is there's an influence goes from the eyes when you look at something that can affect what you look at. That's one controversial possibility, a suggestion. But then it leaves a still bigger question of, even if that's happening, then how could an animal or a person detect it from behind? It's not through the skin, because we've done tests that show that it's, people fully clothed with gloves on and scarf on, viewed from behind, can still detect it, and furry animals covered with fur can detect it. So it's something else. I think it's probably some kind of bioelectric field around the body that's involved. But this is still a way away from explaining it. Personally, I'm drawn to things we don't understand. That's what I find most exciting about science. I mean, a lot of people are not. They prefer to work on areas where it's a matter of filling in the details, but I'm irresistibly drawn to these areas where so little is understood. How it would change the world is that if telepathy exists, if the sense of being stared at exists, What they would suggest is that our minds are much more extensive than our brains. They're not confined to the inside of the head. And that would be a major revolution in understanding of the nature of the mind. And consciousness research is a very active field of science at the moment. And it's not as if the mechanistic materialist theory of consciousness has been very successful. It's one of the things that's hardest to explain. That's why it's called the hard problem. The very existence of consciousness in the philosophy of mind is called the hard problem, because it's so hard to explain why you should be conscious at all if it's just a matter of physical processes inside brains. So I think part of the clue to the hard problem is recognizing that minds work through fields. They're not confined to the inside of heads. And we're used to the idea of magnetic fields stretching out beyond magnets. We're used to the idea of gravitational fields stretching out beyond the moon and the earth and the sun and so on. And we're used to the idea of electromagnetic fields stretching out beyond mobile phones. All of these fields are invisible. And in fact, almost all modern technology is based on electromagnetic fields of one kind or another, invisible fields. And no one has a problem with there being invisible fields that stretch out beyond material objects. And I think the same is true of minds. I think minds are field-like, that the fields work on the brain and interact with the brain and all the chemical and electrical processes within it, but are not confined to the inside of the head and stretch out beyond us in every act of perception. Like when I see your image on the computer screen now, I don't think my image. I don't think it was a little Eleanor inside my head, and I'm just referring the image of you that's actually inside my head to a screen about 2 feet in front of me. I think that your image that I'm seeing is actually where it seems to be, about 2 feet in front of me. In other words, projected out. And when I look at something in a mirror, what I'm seeing is my projections that go straight through the mirror. The light's bent by the mirror, but the projections go straight through, creating virtual images behind the mirror. Everyone agrees that the images we see in mirrors are virtual images created by our minds. But then, in physics textbooks, the question of how they get there is just left unexplained. It says that they're projected, but how are they projected? So again, the very simplest act of perception, visual perception, turns out to be deeply mysterious. And again, that's why I'm so interested in it. I mean, most people don't think about it, or they assume it's been explained centuries ago, but actually it hasn't. So I think that the real changes that will change the world, because I think science is massively important in our culture. It's obvious to everyone that it is. I think the real major change in the science of mind or consciousness and life would have a massive change on the way we think about ourselves and interact with each other and with nature.
Absolutely. And I think what you were just explaining at the end there is, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you were describing a bit about your theory of morphic resonance. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on exactly what this hypothesis describes.
Well, I'm afraid we're just going from one heresy to another here, but the morphic resonance is officially a heresy. It was condemned as one by the editor of Nature. So if anyone says, there's heresies in science, then yes, there are, and here is one. It's basically the idea that nature is governed by habits, not laws. And the idea that nature is governed by laws was baked into science in the 17th century, at the beginning of mechanistic science. And the people who thought of laws of nature were people like Sir Francis Bacon, who was Lord Chancellor of England. He was the top lawyer in England, so obviously he thought in terms of laws, and he thought nature was governed by laws. And people like Galileo and Newton all thought in terms of laws of nature. But for them, the law metaphor wasn't simply a vague metaphor. They thought that the laws were created by God and that God was the cosmic lawgiver and law enforcement agency. And the very concept of law is, of course, based on a metaphor with human law. Human laws are only found in human societies, and they're not even found in all human societies. Tribes have customs. only civilized societies have laws. And so basically, the idea of laws of nature projects onto nature a very human anthropocentric concept of laws, originally based on anthropocentric concept of God as a cosmic lawgiver. A lot of scientists are now atheists, so they've got rid of God, but they're left with free-floating eternal laws, which are somehow beyond time and space, and never change, all supposed to be there at the moment of the Big Bang. And what I'm saying is that in a radically evolutionary universe, it makes more sense to think of the laws themselves as evolving, like real human laws do. The laws of England today are different from those 100 years ago. Or better, to use the metaphor of habit, which is not just confined to people. I mean, animals have habits. We even talk of crystal habits. So habits are very widespread in nature. And so I think it's a better metaphor than law. So basically what I'm saying is that there's a kind of memory in nature, and that the underlying these habits of nature, and the memory works on the principle of similarity. A similar pattern of vibratory activity influences a subsequent similar pattern across time and space, and that's the process I call morphic resonance. Morphic because it's about form or shape, and resonance because resonance involves an automatic recognition of similarity, as in acoustic resonance or in electromagnetic resonance. When you tune in a radio or TV set, you're tuning into a particular resonant frequency, and it resonates across space. I'm saying something similar is happening across time, from the past to the present. And the idea of a memory in nature is very unfamiliar in Western thought, because we've been so influenced by the idea of eternal forms or ideas, which goes right back to Plato. It was really just a revival of Platonism in the 17th century that baked it into science. But in Eastern thought, in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, the idea of a memory in nature is completely mainstream and taken for granted by most Hindus and Buddhists, even fairly unsophisticated Hindus. The idea of a memory in nature is absolutely standard in Hinduism. So I thought of these ideas when I was working in the biochemistry department in Cambridge, and as you can probably imagine, they didn't go over too well in the biochemistry tea room. They went over better on high table at Clare College, where I was a fellow. Some historians and philosophers there were enormously helpful in helping me discuss and think about these ideas. But I then went to work in India. I left Cambridge and worked as a plant physiologist in an international agricultural research institute in Hyderabad, India. I was called the principal plant physiologist. And so I was for 7 years in India, and working among Indians, particularly among Hindus. Whenever they asked me about morphic resonance, I told them the idea, instead of being baffled or surprised or horrified or outraged, the usual reaction was, "Oh, there is nothing new in this idea. Ancient rituals or seers have said this thousands of years ago." And so they were completely, didn't have much curiosity in exploring it through scientific experiments, which was what I was interested in. They just rather complacently said, "Oh, everyone knows this all along. Everyone's always known this, and nothing new in it." So it was slightly frustrating to find everyone so unexcited by it and so taking it for granted without the need for any evidence. For me, the big issue is how to get evidence, how to do experiments to test these hypotheses. And I'm primarily an experimental scientist, so that's what I do, and I'm still doing quite a number of experiments on both on the sense of being stared at, telepathy, and morphic resonance.
And do you think that, you described this element of memory in morphic resonance, would it also be applicable to understanding like mental memory itself? Would it help us understand how we remember things in the past?
Yes, this is its most radical implication, because morphic resonance is based on similarity. And if you ask who was similar to yourself in the past, who was most similar to yourself in the past, the answer is yourself. we're more similar to ourselves in the past than we are to anyone else. Therefore, the most specific resonance working on us from the past is from our own past, self-resonance. And in the realm of form, I think this helps to explain why we and other organisms preserve a similar form over time, even though there's constant turnover of the proteins and the cells within the body. And in the realm of behavior and to do with the activity of the brain, I think that the resonance from the past underlies both habit memory and episodic memory, when you can remember something you did yesterday or last year or an incident from your childhood. The official view, of course, is that all this is stored inside the brain as physical memory traces. And people have spent 100 years trying to find these physical memory traces with very limited success. They all keep being elusive over and over again. Hundreds of billions of dollars and entire thousands of scientific careers have been devoted to this quest with remarkably little to show for it. And I think the reason people haven't found the memory traces is because they're not there. I think they're no more there in the brain than the traces of something you watched on a TV yesterday would be inside your TV set. So I think the brain's more like a TV receiver than a video recorder, and that it's tuning in to the memories from the past. And of course, if you have brain damage, you can affect memory, concussion, bullet wounds, strokes, and so forth. But the same with the TV set. If I damage a TV set, you can affect the reception or the pictures or the sounds. It doesn't prove it's all stored inside the TV set. So, that is one of the most radical implications of morphic resonance for memory. And what it suggests is that individual memory and collective memory, a bit like what Jung called the collective unconscious, are both, they're different in degree. They're similar, they're different aspects of the same phenomenon. They're not different in kind. Where the conventional view is, of course, that individual memory is stored inside the brain, or possibly in other parts of the body, but materially stored. And the collective memory that Jung talked about, the conventional view, is that it doesn't exist because it's impossible. I'm saying that every species has a kind of collective memory, not just humans. That's how morphic resonance works. But the specific memory from an individual is the most powerful. And if an individual has another individual extremely like them, in other words, an identical twin, then you'd have a preferential morphic resonance between twins, even if they're separated soon after birth. And there are many, many similarities in the lives of twins separated soon after birth, which the Minnesota twin studies have shown and other twin research. And the usual conclusion from this is, well, that proves genetic determinism. If there's all these tremendous similarities, it must all be in the genes. But actually, in the normal nature-nurture debate, people assume it's one thing or the other, or possibly a mixture of both. But what they don't consider is that actually morphic resonance would explain the data much better than the genetic determinism. The genetic determinism that arises from twin studies implies a very high degree of heritability for many characteristics. But when the Human Genome Project was completed and people did genome-wide association studies, then the actual amount that genes could explain is much less, and that's called the missing heritability problem. And I think it's because a lot of inheritance depends on morphic resonance as well as genes.
Fascinating. And so the reason I brought up memory is a lot of the topics I talk about on this channel revolve around why we age. And obviously with aging, one of the things that happen is loss of memory with neurodegenerative diseases as well that arise. And I know that this concept of why we age is something that you've also spent a lot of time thinking about. In fact, I did read your recent commentary on this topic. And in that, you sort of discussed that there are potentially two ways in which cells can try to prevent the aging, either by dilution through division or by secreting things into the extracellular environment. So I'm just curious if you could perhaps elaborate on your thinkings about why is it that we age and using that knowledge, what we can do to sort of prevent or slow down the aging process.
Yes, I worked on aging when I was in the biochemistry department at Cambridge just before I went to India. And I published a paper on it in Nature called The Aging, Growth and Death of Cells. And I couldn't continue that research because I was working on plants in India. And then when I got back to England, I was doing other kinds of research. But during the lockdown of COVID, I had the opportunity to really spend a long time catching up on aging research because I've always been fascinated by it. And my paper in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, my recent paper on called Cellular Senescence, Rejuvenation and Potential Immortality, is an attempt to take further what I was doing at Cambridge. It's not related to morphic resonance, it's more conventional in the sense that it's all within the framework of accepted mechanistic science, although the ideas themselves may not be. What I try to do in that paper is resolve a debate which has been going on since the 19th century between two very different views of aging. One, the view of Maupas, who was a French biologist who discovered C. rhabditis elegans, which its official name is C. elegans Maupas, and worked on small organisms, mainly paramecium. And Maupas thought that all cells age, and that as time goes on, there's wear and tear and accumulation of wet breakdown products. And what needs explaining is not aging, but rejuvenation. That was his view. And the opposite view was Weizmann, who had such an influence on genetics, because they're famous for his soma germplasm distinction. August Weizmann, who was German, said that cells are basically immortal, that unicellular organisms can go on and on forever, just dividing with no aging at all. The same is true of microorganisms, he said. The same is true of germ cells, egg and sperm cells. And what needs explaining is not immortality, going on and on forever, but senescence. And he thought senescence evolved only in the context of multicellular organisms. And that theory became quite influential in the 70s and 80s and 90s. It was part of the ideas of the Orgel's error accumulation error catastrophe theory. And there were all sorts of theories to try and explain aging as something that happened in multicellular organisms. So the people who did that took the immortality of the germ cells for granted and of single-celled organisms. So interestingly, these two different views dominated in different parts of biology. And in multicellular biology with animals and plants, evidence quickly grew in the last 20 or 30 years that there is indeed an accumulation of waste products in cells as they age, and that, just as I suggested in my paper in Nature, before it was possible to show this empirically, what happens in asymmetric cell division is that one cell gets the junk and the other one is wiped clean. And this is what happens in stem cells in the gut, the skin, the intestinal lining, the blood cells, the hematopoietic cells. All these stem cells produce daughter cells which die, like skin cells, blood cells, intestinal lining cells. And the same is true in plants, and the meristems of plants and the root tips and shoot tips. They produce, asymmetrically divide. The meristem cell is regenerated as a new, totally rejuvenated cell. And the cell it gives rise to becomes a leaf or the bark or the wood or the root, outside part of the root, and it dies. So don't show any aging. They're constantly rejuvenated through asymmetric cell division. And so that was what I proposed in my Nature paper. There was rejuvenation through cell division. But what I couldn't explain was HeLa cells and other immortal cell lines grown in tissue culture, which divide symmetrically. So this was I've been wrestling with this problem for decades. How can one explain that? Um, and then I realized that what could happen is that if these cells can excrete waste products in vesicles, extracellular vesicles or exosomes, they could be rejuvenated without having to divide symmetrically, and all the cells could be rejuvenated. And I think that may happen in amoeba and in various unicellular organisms. Um, and I think it may happen in egg cells, which form an awful lot of vesicles, and embryonic stem cells, which are a naturally immortal cell line when grown in culture. Well, it's not natural; it's artificial to grow them in culture. Are known to excrete very large numbers of exosomes, and so do HeLa cells and can, transformed cell lines in culture, which are basically cancerous. So how I think that the whole thing can be explained is that I think there is an excretion mechanism for getting rid of waste products in many unicellular organisms. Um, but when multicellular organisms occur, if all the cells were pumping out their waste products into the intracellular spaces, intercellular spaces, then the whole body would be a kind of open sewer. So I think what happens is they're switched off, these export systems, when embryonic stem cells just became regular stem cells. They're only in vivo, they're only embryonic stem cells for a day or two, but it's only in the pre-implantation stage in the human fetus, just in the few days before they implant in the uterus wall, that these cells multiply the number of cells in the embryo, which then get turned into normal cells and can only overcome aging by asymmetric division. But before that, there's a sac, there's a fluid-filled sac, which is like a sewer in which they can export these things. And I think that cancerous cells regain this ability to export these vesicles, so-called oncogenes. Many of them are actually cell genes that are expressed normally in embryonic stem cells. So I think cancer cells cheat by regaining this function, which is characteristic of embryonic stem cells and probably of unicellular organisms. So I think that Weissmann, when he took for granted the ability of cells to go on without aging, was actually right in the sense that what he was saying may be explained by the excretion of exosomes or extracellular vesicles containing waste products. But I think that Mopaus was also right in saying that all cells age all the time, and in many cells the waste products accumulate and give rise to aging. And now, how it would affect cancer is that if one could, one more important point is that the embryonic stem cells, because they're adapted to live in very low oxygen conditions, about 2% oxygen tension in the fallopian tubes, that's where the embryo is when they're dividing, they work mainly by glycolysis rather than oxidative phosphorylation. And the whole mode of operation of an embryonic stem cell is glycolytic energy production. Now, when cells undergo cancerous transformation, they become glycolytic. They activate this non-oxidative phosphorylation energy production. When the people were trying to cure cancer 10, 20 years ago, they thought, well, let's try and find ways of blocking the vascular system to tumors because that'll deprive them of oxygen. They won't do very well. They love it because they're basically, they've activated, in my view, the embryonic stem cell genes, and therefore they're not going to be stopped by lack of oxygen. That's what they actually prefer. So in terms of dealing with cancer, I suppose one way is to find ways of turning back on the genes that happen in normal cells when they switch from embryonic stem cells to regular cells and stop excreting the waste products. In that case, cancer cells would undergo normal aging, except insofar as they can regenerate by having stem cell populations within them, which some do. So that's the approach I would take, first of all, testing it to see whether HeLa cells and other transformed cell lines in vivo are actually excreting these waste products. I mean, there's already evidence that suggests they are. Secondly, looking for unicellular organisms, seeing if that's what they do. Thirdly, looking at egg cells and seeing if that's how they are continually rejuvenated, because egg cells, in the human case, the egg cells are already formed in girl embryos when they're still embryos, and they may not be activated till 40 years later. And if a woman has a child at age 40, which many do, then this same cell has somehow resisted the aging process for 40 years. And I think to do that, it must be able to excrete these waste products. And it also undergoes a highly asymmetric division, because the production of egg cells involves a highly asymmetric division producing the first polar body, and then the second meiotic cell division produces another polar body, and the polar bodies are small dark cells that die within a day or two. So I'm pretty sure that I'm not sure, but I think they're likely to be ways of excreting the junk. But I don't think that would be enough to keep them going for 40 years. And I think the egg cells are known to excrete extracellular vesicles. And so I think that they, as Weissman suggested, they've retained a system which is common in unicellular organisms. Anyway, that's my hypothesis of aging in a nutshell. And it's not a very fashionable approach at the moment, because a lot of aging research has gone into looking at DNA and mutations in DNA. But it's now becoming, for diagnostic reasons, people are getting much more interested in extracellular vesicles, and there are now blood tests for cancer which depend on detecting characteristic extracellular vesicles given off by the cancer cells. And of course, aging in Alzheimer's and in other neurodegenerative forms of aging does depend on the build-up of waste products, amyloid plaques and other things, which are a kind of exaggerated version of this waste product accumulation. So that all fits in with this general approach as well.
Absolutely. I think that was very well explained. And I really like your analogy of the sewer system. And I think that, firstly, you're right that we should be looking more to see the sort of, even the regulatory pathways that regulate the secretion of the vesicles. But secondly, I guess as well, that sort of biocommunication and whether there's any feedback from the extracellular matrix. So whether or not that also signals back to the cells and how that influences the secretion. As I think, because I guess ultimately my brain's thinking about if that is the case, and if we can, there's two ways in which we could intervene. Either you try to stimulate the cell to increase its secretion to sort of get rid of its damage if it's not going to divide, or we need to sort of find an alternative way to clear out the sewage system to promote the cells to keep secreting. But I'm just being hypothetical here, I suppose.
Well, I know there's a lot of interest at the moment in senolytic processes and senescent cells causing inflammation, and people looking for drugs that can deal with that. But actually, I think they do. I mean, I totally believe in the damage caused by senescent cells accumulating within the body. But there is actually a much simpler way of dealing with it than waiting for new wonder drugs, and much cheaper, which is fasting. I myself fast every year during Holy Week, just before Easter. During Lent, it's a traditional time for fasting, so you can do it at any time, but I do it then because you get the added bonus. It's part of a tradition. I usually have 4 days with just water and tea, no food, no solid food or carbs or anything. And within 24 hours you go into ketosis, and then there's been studies on fasting and its effects. It's well known that fasting has life-extending effects, even in fruit flies and even in E. coli. So there's something to do with caloric deprivation and fasting with mice. if you feed mice every other day compared with every day, the mice that have fasted on alternative days live 30% longer. So there's a huge amount of evidence for the effects of fasting. So if I ran the NHS, I'd launch a whole program of fasting research because it'd be much cheaper for the NHS to have fasting counsellors to help people to fast. For people who are fasting, it's cheaper because you actually save money. You don't. It's not just cheap. It's sort of you have positive financial benefits from doing it, as opposed to pumping billions into developing weight loss drugs and things, which and other things that would help senolytic get rid of these senescent cells. Of course, no one does that because there's no money in fasting for drug companies, but there would be money in it for the NHS because the NHS has to pick up the bills, and if they can save money and have something that's effective and cheaper, it would be a fantastic program for the NHS to look at. But as far as I know, no one's doing it.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And so to sort of wrap things up a bit, because I know that you had limited time today, I'm just wondering if you have any advice for my audience who are either like myself, early in careers or even later stage. What are the things that we could be doing now to really make a difference in scientific progress? And I guess just more general advice that you have.
Well, I think that as I show in my book, The Science Delusion, I think that current sciences, the sciences are being held back by limiting assumptions that are carryovers from mechanistic revolution in the 17th century and 19th century materialism, which was a very limited view of nature. And they've got baked into the foundations of all the sciences. And what I show in my book, The Science Delusion, is that the 10 principal dogmas of science, if you turn them into questions, open up a whole range of new possibilities that are not anti-science, they're very pro-science because they make it a whole range of things we don't understand now which we could understand if we applied ourselves to it. The number of people doing research outside conventional frameworks is vanishingly small. The sense of being stared at that I referred to, I think there are probably 3 people in the whole world doing research on this because it's so taboo that no one dares do it, and you wouldn't get a grant and hard to get papers published and that sort of thing. It wouldn't be good for the research assessment exercise or all the normal institutional constraints. So I personally think that for younger scientists, I think the revolution towards a more holistic view is definitely going to come. It has to come because the present system's sclerotic and there's an innovation deficit. It's less creative. More and more scientists are yielding less and less really innovative results. So the law of diminishing return is kicked in a big way for institutional science. So it's going to change. And so I think it will get much more interesting and exciting. This holistic research is, generally speaking, much cheaper and will be easier to do. I know that most young scientists feel they've got to stay on the rails because otherwise they won't get their PhD or they won't get their postdoc, or if they've got their postdocs, they won't get some tenured appointment and stuff. I mean, very, very narrowing limits on what people feel they can do. But I think one thing that everyone can do is speak more freely, because I give talks on these rather heretical ideas in science in scientific institutions. I've done it many times. And almost always what happens is, well, often what happens is that some militant skeptic tries to get me disinvited. That often happens. And usually the person who invites me knows that's likely to happen, so they're prepared for it. So they ignore that. Then lots of people turn up to the talk. And usually after the talk, there's a few fairly polite questions about statistical methods and things. And then after the talk, in the tea break or the drink session afterwards, person after person comes up to me and says, this is really interesting. I've had these experiences myself. My dog knows when I'm coming home from the lab. I always know when my partner's going to ring because I just get that feeling, and then before the phone even rings. It's another thing I do research on, telephone telepathy. Or I've had this feeling of being stared at, or I look at people and they just turn round. It's uncanny. And they say all these kinds of things to me, and I say, well, have you discussed them with your colleagues? And they say, well, no, everyone here is so straight, you see. And then another one comes up, and the next one, the next one. And by the time 4 or 5 people have done this, I say, why don't you discuss it with the company? They say, well, they're also. I said, well, I know they're not, because they say, how do you know? I said, because they just told me. They're really interesting. Him and her and her and him. And points them across the room. And so it's the culture of science is in many departments is a bit like gay people in the 1950s, when they were all pretending to be straight, and even to other people who were gay. And the gay liberation movement really changed that. And I think something analogous to that, a kind of holistic liberation movement within science. If people felt free to talk in the tea room, about psychic experiences, psychedelic experiences, spiritual experiences, near-death experiences, altered states of consciousness, lucid dreams, unorthodox theories of cellular organization, memory and nature, etc., etc. A lot of people would actually be interested, and the culture of science would begin to change. And that's something that costs nothing, and it's probably easiest to do in the evenings. Lots of people already do it in the evenings with colleagues who's in the evening after a glass or two of wine, are usually much more broad-minded and open than when they get to the lab the next morning, and then they tighten up again. I just think science would be so much more fun if there was a kind of liberation movement of this kind. And so what I'd say is to younger scientists is that most people are not Richard Dawkins type militant atheists and skeptics. Recent surveys that were done by the Scientific and Medical Network have shown that hardcore materialists were about 25% of the scientific, engineering and medical communities in Britain, France and Germany. And then people who describe themselves as non-religious or materialists are about 45%. About 45% describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, or religious. So it's about equal numbers of people who are non-religious and religious within the scientific and medical communities. And if you look at spiritual things are perhaps a bigger question, but if you look at interest in psychic abilities, most people have had the experience of telephone telepathy, something like 75%. Even in science labs, I once gave a talk at the European Molecular Biology Lab in Heidelberg, and I spent the afternoon talking to the director of the institute, and he was very friendly, and he told me that he always knew when his wife was calling through telephone telepathy. And during my talk, which was packed, and there must have been 200 people there, standing room only, I talked about my research on telephone telepathy, and I said, 70-80% of the population have had this experience. It's very common. I just don't know how common it is among molecular biologists. And so how many of you had this experience? And there was a kind of embarrassed silence and nothing happened. Then I looked at the director, and because we got on well and stuff, he slowly put his hand up, and the hand slowly went up all around the room till it was about 80%. So I'm convinced that the culture of science could be so much more fun if people just drop these quite unnecessary inhibitions and fears and intellectual straitjackets, and it would become much more creative if people feel freer in their thinking. So that's what I think, and I certainly have more fun doing what I'm doing than a lot of my colleagues who haven't gone off the rails. I'm not recommending going off the rails because, in my own case, when I wrote my book on morphic resonance, I realized this was a radical step. And when it came out, when I was denounced as a heretic by the editor of Nature, on the front page of Nature and as an editorial. He tried to excommunicate me, and he succeeded. It meant I was unemployable from then on. So I've had to have private funding, which luckily I've had. So I'm not recommending going quite that far, because unless you feel secure in your, if you've got a private income, you could do that. But I am suggesting pushing the boundaries as much as possible, and especially in private conversation, which is the best way to open up. And I think that the future of the sciences would be so much more fun and much more productive if this happened.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I guess you'd be happy to know that I have already tried to discuss some of these topics with my colleagues at work, and hopefully listeners listening to this episode as well would be doing the same going forwards. So I can only highly recommend my viewers to read your books, as from me at least, it really opens my mind to new ideas. And I think for me, the concept of science is about embracing the unknown and being curious, but obviously backing it with evidence, but you still have to be able to accept the possibilities. And so thank you for coming on today and just talking to me about your work and experience. It's been really insightful and just good fun. So I can only wish you the best of luck going forward, and I look forward to hearing more about your work in the future.
Well, thank you, Eleanor, and good luck with your series. I'm really glad you're doing it.
Thank you very much.